It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Jonathan Lacey. Jonathan's obviously an alumni of the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at the University of Melbourne. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge and then actually came back to Melbourne to work as a senior researcher for a number of years in photonics. Like many of our students, he then went off into industry, but Jonathan made the big journey across to the US for about a decade. He started off as part of the team at HP in Agilent that spun out Agilent's first telecoms networking product, and went on to work in product management in Avago and Caliant Networks. He returned to Australia in 2008, where he launched and led a startup that was run out of Monash, and this is one of the areas that he'll talk about today. Following that project, he went on to start up a consulting company, worked with CSIRO on commercialization of wireless technologies, and more recently has co-founded Cruxes Innovation, which is really centered around getting research out of the labs and having real world impact. I think it's really nice for Jonathan to be talking at a WILAB seminar because WILAB also is a University of Melbourne and RMIT joint initiative with a remit of growing our sovereign capability in wireless communications. This is to be done by enabling frontier technology and developing a talent pipeline. So I'm sure that the lessons that Jonathan has or is going to talk to us about today will be valuable to many of our audience, and I'm really looking forward to his talk. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris, and thanks, Dus, for inviting me to come to this. I was saying to Chris and Dus earlier, this kind of feels like the digital equivalent of coming home. It's always nice to be back with this group. I do apologise to our friends from RMIT for not putting their logo on this slide. Such is my ignorance about the Wireless Innovation Lab that I wasn't actually aware until just a few minutes ago that RMIT was involved. I'm very glad that RMIT is. Done a lot of work with RMIT over the last few years, and there's some fantastic stuff going on there. So please assume that there is an RMIT logo on this slide. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge I'm sitting here in Ballarat at the moment. So Ballarat is and always will be the lands of the Wadawurrung people. So I just want to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of the land that I'm sitting on at the moment, and pay my respects to leaders in that community and leaders in other Indigenous communities, past, present, and emerging, who might be with us today. This is the bit where I was planning for this to be a more normal Zoom call, and I could just kind of look at everybody in the face and say, I'm interested to know who's with us today. But let's have a go at this. Maybe if rather than using the Q&A, you just use the chat. Be interested to know which, if any, of these categories you'd put yourself in, just so we've got a bit of a feel for who's here. Are you a PhD student, a postdoc, an academic, other university staff, or are you from industry or the broader community outside university? So yeah, let's just take a couple of minutes to see what people are saying. Lots of, Glenn from industry. Hello, Glenn. Great to see lots of familiar names and faces. Hello, Colin. Fantastic. More people from industry, that's really good. Great, so we've got a really nice mix of people from lots of different walks of life here. And we're also very lucky to have with us Rod Tucker and Don Hewitt, who both have played a very important part in me being here. So really pleased to see them. I want to ask you another question. This talk is about creating impact from research, about getting research out of the research community and out into the broader world and making a positive difference in that broader world with research. So just want to get a feel before I start rabbiting on about my experience of creating impact with research. I just want to know how important people, those of us who are researchers, how importantly we regard that, where we put that in our list of priorities. Would you say that it's one of your top 2 priorities as a researcher, one of the main couple of things that gets you out of bed in the morning? I'm guessing that the fact that you're here listening to this talk, which was very clearly about impact, means that the population here is probably a little bit biased, but I'm just interested in getting a feel for how people see that as a priority. So yeah, a couple of people are putting that up in their top list of priorities. I'm interested to hear from people. I don't want people to feel that they can't speak up if they don't see this as a top priority. I'm going to tell some stories today about my experiences of trying, in some cases unsuccessfully, in some cases a little more successfully, to create impact with research. That doesn't mean it's for everybody, but hopefully some of the stories today will provide some ideas to people who are interested in this and do see it as a priority. As Chris said before, I really do want this to continue to be really interactive. So both Chris and Das will be watching the Q&A and the chat as we talk. So please use either to ask questions as the talk goes on, and we will actually stop and answer them along the way. Of course, there'll also be time at the end for questions as well. But please, as soon as something comes into your mind that you want to ask about or that you want to comment on, please just jump in straight away and we'll talk about it. So the reason that I'm here, and the reason, in fact, that Cruxes Innovation exists, I'm not going to say much about it, but the reason that it exists is I believe that Australian research is absolutely brilliant. We punch way above our weight in terms of world rankings, and the potential for Australian research to make a really big positive difference in the world, to really address some of the very, very wicked and difficult problems that the world is facing at the moment, I think is just enormous. And so I'm really keen to talk, as I'm doing today, about my experiences in trying to create impact with research in the hope that other people won't make the same mistakes that I did, and that huge potential of Australian research to make a difference in the world is realised, because I think the possibilities are really, really exciting. So what I'd like to do is just tell 3 little stories about research translation experiences that I've been involved with, and just sort of draw out something that I learnt from each of them. And the first one is about the need to understand and love and really engage with the problem that our research is trying to solve before we get too wrapped up in the solution. And I'm going to tell a story about where I didn't do that and talk about the consequences of it. The second story is about the idea that timing is really important. There are some factors that we can control when it comes to creating impact with our research. There are some things that we can't control. And so just having an understanding of the context in which we're trying to create impact, and the things that, the ducks that need to be lined up, if you'd like, in the world, in order for our research to create impact is really important. And the third story I want to tell is to do with something that I'm really quite passionate about, which is the belief that it's those of us who are researchers, each of us has a personal responsibility to make sure that our research is actually creating impact. That doesn't mean that each of us need to become startup founders. That's something that might appeal to some of us, and if it does appeal to you, I'm right behind you. It's very, very exciting, but it isn't for everyone. But each of us, I believe, does have a responsibility to make sure that our research is creating impact, and there is a role for each of us in doing that. So the third story will talk about some experiences I've seen there. So the first story I'd like to tell is this one about loving the problem, not the solution. Now, the fact that this some of you probably know who this is. This is Professor Arthur Lowry, who is at Monash University, the other place. But his first job in Australia was actually at the University of Melbourne. And I was lucky enough, Dust and I, in fact, and Rod and Don Hewitt and some of the other people who are here today were lucky enough to work with Arthur there. The fact that his photo is sitting underneath the word problem is completely coincidence. He was not the problem here. He was part of the solution. So back in the early part of this century, in the mid-2000s, the telecommunications industry had successfully deployed 3G mobile communications. So mobile communication was becoming quite ubiquitous. The next step was, okay, let's increase the capacity of the network such that it can actually support mobile video. That was what became 4G. And so there was a huge amount of innovation going on around the world to try and make this possible. The part of it that we were focused on was the core network, the optical fiber part of the network. So we were trying to figure out how to increase the capacity of that network by a factor of at least 10, so that mobile video could be supported. And Arthur came up with a really exciting way to do this. So it was very clear that this next generation of wireless communication was going to be the first generation that was based on what we now call electronic dispersion compensation. So there was enough power in electronic processing that it was possible to assist optical fiber transmission with real-time, very, very high-speed electronic processing. And that opened up a whole range of new possibilities in terms of the capacity and the reach of these systems. So it was very clear that this generation was going to be based on electronic dispersion compensation. Most of the bets at the time when we sort of came onto the scene were based on a single approach, which we'll call single carrier transmission. Arthur came up with a completely different approach. So he borrowed a technique that was well established in wireless communications at the time, OFDM, which will be very familiar to many of you, and came up with an optical version of OFDM, which is kind of diagrammatically represented there. So Arthur did some really groundbreaking experiments in his lab, showed that not only was this possible, but that under some circumstances it worked better than the single carrier approach. And at that point, we had Arthur, who was very, very keen to see his inventions make a difference in the world. We had Monash University, who were really excited about the idea of their name being attached to some really big commercial successes here that might make a big difference in the world. We had a group of investors in Australia who had recently invested in another optical fiber component company that they'd made a huge amount of money out of. So they were looking to make another bet in this area. And we had a market that was trying to figure out how to do 4G. So it looked like we were in absolutely the right place at the right time. Arthur had invented all this stuff, and he wanted to be involved with the company, but he didn't want to lead it. He'd done that before. He realized it was a heck of a lot of work, and he wanted to stay in academia. So he wanted to spend 1 or 2 days a week in the company, but he wanted someone else to lead the company. So I was asked to come and lead the company. So all this was looking pretty good. You know, we had this brilliant technology, we had a fantastic inventor, we had a great market opportunity. We had investors that were basically just beating the doors down to give us lots and lots of money. I mean, how could we go wrong? We managed to go wrong. I managed to go wrong. And where I went wrong, with hindsight, was, you know, I started talking with Arthur about this. I heard about this idea a few years before this happened, and as soon as I heard of it, I thought, gee, that sounds brilliant. So I really fell in love with this idea. I just thought it was the most elegant, the most brilliant idea ever. That, of course, and you know, Arthur felt much the same way about it. That, of course, was our greatest strength. Our passion for this idea was our greatest strength. But it also turned out to be, in my case, my greatest weakness. Because we were in this situation where it was clear that there was an opportunity here. It was also clear that the single carrier, you know, our competitors, were a little ahead of us. That research in that area had been going on a little bit longer, and they were a little bit further towards having a product. We didn't know how much further ahead of us they were, though. So before we established this company, Arthur and I spent a number of months traveling the world, essentially, talking to potential customers for these products, and you know, finding out what they wanted. And so we convinced ourselves, I convinced myself in particular, because it was my responsibility, that there was a huge opportunity there, that the single carrier approach, you know, the door wasn't closed, that ship hadn't sailed, but there was an opportunity for an upstart, a new approach. And so that was the story that I took to the investors and to Monash. That was when we founded this company that became known as Ophidium. And we took on huge amounts of investors' money and many, many patents from Monash. And we hired a big team to build products out of this. And that's a picture of a very, very early prototype. You can see it's kind of held together with bits of double-sided tape and all sorts of things. But that was a very early prototype of our product that we took to some field trials at one of those customers there. About a year after that happened, the company was wound up. We were all looking for new jobs, and Ophidium wasn't developing products anymore. It was basically a shell company that held a bunch of patents and was looking to license them. So the whole thing was a colossal failure. What went wrong? What went wrong? Well, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, needless to say. I took that failure really very personally. And so I felt that I kind of owed it to all of those people that had put their trust in me, the Monash, Arthur, the investors, my team, you know, our customers, our suppliers, their customers, everybody that had put their trust in this whole thing. I felt I really owed it to them to spend a lot of time thinking about what went wrong. And this is the understanding that I've come to, that our passion as researchers for our research, for the brilliance, the novelty of our ideas, and in this case it wasn't my idea, it was Arthur's idea. But I was more in love with it than anybody else. Our passion can be our greatest strength, but it can also be our greatest weakness. And in this case, the weakness was, I wanted to hear everybody tell me that there was an opportunity there, that the door hadn't closed, you know, that the single carrier ship hadn't sailed, that there was still room for another alternative, and that therefore it was worth us pouring huge amounts of money and time and effort and hiring a team and building as fast as we could to get this product off the ground. That wasn't actually true. Now, I'm not saying that our customers lied to us. They didn't lie to us. The problem was that I didn't ask them the right questions. I wanted them to say, wow, this looks great. Sure, we want you to do this. Off you go, build your company. Sure, we'll test your product. But I mean, the fact is, if you're one of those big companies that's listed on the previous slide, you've got a team of 12 or 15 photonics people that are there to test things. So saying, yes, I'll give you a week of those people's time isn't really very much of a commitment. And of course, why wouldn't they say that? I mean, until they're absolutely sure that the competitor's product is going to work for them, why wouldn't they keep the door open to an alternative? The question that I wish I'd asked them is, okay, exactly what do you need to see from us to guarantee that you will buy our product and not the other ones? And will you write that down for me on a piece of paper? Will you give me a conditional purchase order that says, when I deliver a product that has these specifications on this date at this price, you will buy this many hundreds of thousands of dollars of them. And by the way, why don't you give me a few of those hundreds of thousands of dollars now so I can get the development done more quickly? That's the question that I would ask now, because that's really not just, you know, do you like my slides and do you think I'm a nice guy and do you think Arthur's got a good idea? But do you really have an unsolved problem? Is there really something that you're seeing that the other guys aren't going to do for you? What is the reason that you genuinely need to have an alternative here? And if I'd asked that question right at the very beginning, I think what I would have got would have been some very, very high technical hurdles that for a pretty small amount of money, we probably could have proved that we couldn't actually do. You know, we might have got someone who'd stuck their necks out and said, I want to do something different from the other guys. Yeah, I will actually, you know, I'll back you financially to do this and make a commitment to you. But as it was, when push came to shove, the other guys were ahead of us. They did ask the right questions. They did get those commitments from the customers. And when it came time for us to actually ask people for purchase orders, they'd all signed up with the other guys. And the door was closed on us, and that was the beginning of the end for Ophidium. So, you know, effectively all of that time, effort, and money that all of those people put into it was wasted, because ultimately it didn't lead to any impact. And it would have been possible, you know, asking the right questions to have seen that at the time. So I've just given my version of the answer to that question there. What might we have done differently? If we'd asked different questions before we started spending all the money, that would have probably led us to a different outcome. And I guess that, you know, this was very clearly a product development exercise, which is not, you know, not what we do in universities, but the same sort of philosophy applies to any research project. Before I spend a whole bunch of, you know, the ARC's money or my industry partners' money and a whole lot of my time and a whole lot of my colleagues' time and a whole lot of support from the university on doing a research project. Okay, I mean, if this is pure blue sky research and the only reason I'm doing it is to increase humankind's knowledge, then that's great. And we've got to do that. Don't get me wrong. That's really important. But if I'm telling myself that part of the reason I'm doing this is to actually make a difference in the world, before I do the project, before I spend the money and the time, I better make sure I understand what the problem is that I'm actually solving. And that's what we didn't do in this case. I might just pause there and see if people, before I move on to the next story, which is a happier story, by the way, just to see if people have got questions or comments about that particular disaster. So Colin's asking, what was the winning product? There were a handful of them, but they were all very similar, and they were all in that single carrier kind of category, which again, it was, all of those products were very different from the previous generation in that they did use this new approach called electronic dispersion compensation, but the single carrier electronic dispersion compensation approach was a lot less radical than our approach. But you know what our competitors, the winners, proved was that it was good enough. It wasn't as elegant, it wasn't as beautiful, it wasn't as revolutionary as ours, but it was good enough, and they got there first. And so it was a combination of them being a little bit ahead of us and our customers judging that there was a little bit less technical risk in what they were doing than what we were doing. That was what won the day for them. So most of the big telecommunications equipment manufacturers these days have this capability, either have the capability in-house or they buy it from a small handful of vendors. There were only about 4 or 5, maybe 4 companies, maybe 5 in the world that actually figured out how to do this. But yeah, they were the ones that beat us. And one of them was a startup. The others were in-house efforts. Sorry, 2 of them were startups. The others were in-house efforts within big equipment manufacturers, you know, companies like Nokia and Huawei.
Jonathan, there's just a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you can see those, but Kevin's asked, do you feel the problem with your product was technical or commercial in nature?
Oh, look, there wasn't a problem with the product. There was a problem with the CEO. There was a problem with the strategy. The mistake that was made wasn't anything to do with the technology. This is my view. It wasn't anything to do with the technology or with the way that my team developed a product based on the technology. The problem was the decision to do it in the first place and the circumstances under which we started doing it. We needed to have a much clearer understanding of what the commercial realities of the situation were. We needed to understand, you know, like I said before, with hindsight, with the experience that I've had now, the questions that I would be asking those prospective customers, that wouldn't be the first question that I'd ask them, but you know, once we'd had a bit of conversation, it would be, okay, let's figure out, I don't want you to tell me every single thing about my competitors' products because you're not going to do that. But talk about your requirements, talk about the performance that you need from this product, and point me to the corner of that requirement space that's really a big challenge for you right now. Tell me exactly what performance I need to give you to make sure that you'll go with our approach rather than the other guys. So tell me what the hurdles are that I've got to hit. Basically define for me what the proof of concept experiment needs to be. And you know, I mean, that isn't going to be something that I'll just instantly write down on a piece of paper. That'll be a discussion that we'll have over some period of time. And then what I want to attach to that will be, okay, let's really talk brass tacks here. if we can do that, the performance that you've defined there is good enough that if I can do that, if we can do that, if I can bring you a box that does that, then that's it. We're done. You're buying our product. That's what you're going to use, and you won't. You know, that will win the day for us versus the competitors. So the fact that I as CEO and, you know, person in charge of business development failed to do that because I was so in love with the whole thing, because I just wanted to do this anyway, because I wanted people to tell me, yeah, this is a great idea, go on, build one. That was the failure. Everything that the team did after then was brilliant, but we were set up to fail right from day one because, you know, I set the ship sailing in the wrong direction. And I agree with Rod. I mean, disaster, I'm being a bit too dramatic here. Disaster is too strong a word. You know, the fact is that, you know, 9 out of 10 ventures like this are going to fail. But the problem with this one is that we could have figured that out with a lot less money and a lot fewer people's time and effort. We could have wasted much fewer resources and got to the same conclusion much more quickly.
There's also a question from Shamath. Has there been a multi-carrier in industry?
That's a good question, and I'm not close enough to it to give a really definitive answer on that. My understanding is that there's at least one chipset out there at the moment that has a multi-carrier mode, but I'm not sure that anybody uses it at the moment. Because once the ship sort of started sailing in the single carrier direction, then everything kind of got designed around that approach. So, you know, we live in a single carrier world these days, or at least that little part of the world is a single carrier world. So that's a long way of saying I don't think there's any multi-carrier, you know, long haul optical transmission systems being used at the moment. And just to finish off on some of the questions that are on the chat, just before we move on to the next one. Failure is important. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've certainly, so the next story that I'll tell is a success story, and it came after the failure one. And I don't think I would have, I was part of a team that had a small success. And I don't think I would have been able to do that without the failure. And I certainly feel that I learned a heck of a lot more from the failure than I did from the success. In fact, the last company that I did in Silicon Valley, the guy who was my boss at the time, he had a spectacular success with his first business. And the one that I was working with him on was his second one. And it was very clear that he was trying to replicate exactly what he almost kind of wore the same clothes, you know, it was almost that close. And, you know, fair enough. I mean, he'd had a massive success with the first one. But, you know, it was clear that the circumstances had changed, and what worked that time wasn't going to work this time. And he didn't really have anything else to fall back on because he hadn't had those failures. I mean, he was in the process of having one, it turned out. But yeah, failure it's bloody painful. Don't get me wrong. It's really painful. But the opportunity to learn from it is really huge. And if you can sort of manage your failures so that they can be smaller and they can be steps along the way or missteps along the way to a success, that's a much better way of doing it. That's my basic lesson. You know, there's little failures that we could have had right at the beginning that would have avoided the big failure later on. That's really the lesson that I'd like to communicate here. And then one more question on the chat from Glenn. Meaningful distinction between knowing the problem and knowing the impact of the problem. Yeah, look, you're absolutely right, Glenn. It's about kind of knowing the constraints in which the customer's operating or in which the solution has got to operate. So it's knowing the problem and knowing a whole bunch of other stuff that goes around it that I think is important. So, you know, understand the problem is the kind of glib statement that people like you and I make all the time, but it's usually a sort of a multi-dimensional thing, and there's lots of layers to it. But understanding all of that context, understanding the world in which your customers operate, that's really what it's about, I guess. Let me move on to the next story. So the theme that I want to pull out of this one is timing is everything. And this is, again, this is me being involved with trying to create or trying to help create impact from other people's research. I won't claim any of the credit for this. And this was one of the wireless communications research groups at CSIRO. The person who was the head of this group at the time was actually Ian Collins, who's also a UOM alum that Chris knows, and Das and Rod and Don will remember him. Anyway, so this group way back in 2006 had done some really interesting research and a really cool demonstration about the ability to transmit very large amounts of data over fairly long distances using wireless point-to-point wireless communications in a part of the spectrum called the E-band. And this was quite revolutionary at the time. Don't get me wrong, fibre is always best if you've got it, but laying fibre is really expensive, particularly in remote areas. And so there are circumstances under which building wireless towers is a whole lot cheaper and is going to get you there a whole lot more quickly and easily than fibre. So anyway, these guys back in 2006 did this demonstration that really kind of wowed everybody. The problem was the world wasn't ready for that. There were a couple of big things that were missing. The first thing was the semiconductor technology required to actually manufacturably build these sorts of radios. The analog stuff, the front end, wasn't really available then. They kind of cobbled it together with spare parts, and this really was a pretty heroic kind of experiment. The second thing was that spectrum at the time was unregulated, so you weren't actually allowed to use it. So these guys realized, having done this demonstration, they kind of, they kept their ears to the ground, but they kind of put all this on the back burner because they realized that the world, for these reasons, wasn't ready to do this yet. Not even thinking about the whole demand side of things, it wasn't actually possible to build commercial systems like this yet. So I came along about the time that these things started changing, that the regulations started emerging, and that the semiconductor technology started maturing enough that you could actually build these things. The other thing that was happening at about the same time was the NBN, and that was what we all got really excited about. And in fact, that was the reason that CSIRO did this work in the first place. But for political reasons, unfortunately, this technology didn't make it into the NBN because it was felt not to be mature enough. And the whole deployment of the NBN to begin with was, for political reasons, driven very, very quickly, which meant you had to use technology that was nominally mature. The reality of it ended up being quite different, but that was kind of the headline. So we had to look for other opportunities other than the NBN in which to use this technology, in which to actually create some impact with it. And in 2012, we were very lucky to find one. It turned out to be a niche application where people needed not only very, very high data rates over longish distances, 10 or 15 kilometers, but it turned out they also needed very, very low latency. And it turns out, electromagnetic radiation travels more quickly through air than it does through a fiber. So the small amount of latency difference that you would get by doing this through the air rather than through a fiber actually made a difference in this application. There's not many applications like that, but there are a few. And we happened to discover one of those applications in 2012, or in fact, someone else discovered us and said, hey, can you do this? So CSIRO is like a university in this sense, in that it can do proof of concept demonstrations, but it isn't equipped to build products. It never was, and it probably never will be. The way it gets its technology out into products is it finds partners that it works with, industry partners who do actually build products, and it transfers its technology to them, and in partnership they build the products and get the stuff out into the world. So once we'd found this application, the end customer effectively, we then had to find a partner, and we found this what at the time was a very little company in Brisbane called EM Clarity that were up for doing some really adventurous stuff. And so this partnership deal was put in place. And then in 2015, the end customer, not EM Clarity, but their customer, the ones that had come to us in the first place, actually did the first deployment of this technology. And this is a picture of one of these systems being deployed in New Jersey in the US. That in itself was kind of a little victory, but this is a very, very niche application. And the whole reason the technology was developed in the first place was because of its potential to have more mainstream telecommunications applications. Those applications are still being pursued. Our friends at EM in Brisbane are very, very persistent, and they refuse to give up on on finding more mainstream applications and customers for this technology. They're being very, very smart about the way they do it. They're asking all those tough questions that that I didn't ask with Ophidium, and that fortunately the CSIRO team and I did ask in this case. And so I remain hopeful that this technology, the original CSIRO technology, which is now built into these EM Clarity products, will eventually find its way into hopefully 5G. You know, kind of the later generations of 5G, but you know, people are starting to talk already about 6G, in which probably there's even more need for this sort of thing.
So, Jonathan, just a question from Nick. What was the low latency application? You can talk about it.
Yeah, so EM initially, their customer didn't want to reveal their identity or talk about this because the market that they operate in is very competitive. But there's a class of applications in financial services where low latency is really important, and that was the initial deployment of this. There have been some other applications. But they haven't been revealed publicly. But the one that has been talked about is other financial services applications. So the lesson that I took from all this, from this little success and this what I hope will be an ongoing success story is this whole thing about timing. The CSIRO team realized when they did this original work back in 2006 that there were some factors about this that they could control, and there were a bunch of others that they couldn't control. They weren't driving the global semiconductor industry. They had some input to it, but ultimately that was kind of over to a bunch of other people to figure out how to make those very, very high frequency analog front ends with sufficient power output and, you know, sufficiently low noise figure and all that sort of stuff in quantities of more than one. And eventually the semiconductor industry did figure out how to do that. It was also, you know, up to people like them to keep talking to the Australian Communications and Media Agency and to the Federal Communications Commission in the US, the regulators, to say, look, this spectrum is going to be really, really useful. We need to figure out what rules there are going to be to let people use it. And they did. But again, that took time. So I think these guys did a really nice job of understanding the context in which their research was going to have impact, and realizing at what point it was time for them to start pushing again. And so when they saw those things starting to happen, that was when they asked me to come in and help. And we put a whole lot of publicity out there again. Hey, remember this paper that we did in 2006? Here are all the reasons why this is more relevant now. And sure enough, you know, what ended up being the initial end customer, they read it and they said, I think we can use that. They approached us, and that was what kind of ended up driving the rest of it. So part of it, I think, was that we were a bit lucky, but we kind of, I think we did a fairly good job of maximizing the probability that we were going to get lucky there. And once we did, I think, you know, the team executed on it fantastically well. But, you know, even so, it took a long time. I mean, 2006, the first paper, 2015, 9 years later, the first deployment. And the first mass deployments still haven't happened yet. So that's the other thing. Impact can sometimes take a really long time. It takes a lot of persistence. Comments or questions on that one? I'm just going to bore you with one more story. And I want to use this one as a means of illustrating something that I said before, which is I believe really passionately that each of us as researchers, as technologists, we need to take personal responsibility for making sure that our research creates impact. And I think we owe that as much to ourselves as we do to anybody else. Let me just tell you a story about that, and I'll come back and maybe that'll explain what I mean. I was lucky enough to work a couple of years ago with a team from the medical side of the university that was working on a new treatment for a condition called lupus, which until I met them, I didn't know very much about. It turns out it's a really nasty and debilitating autoimmune disease that affects millions of people each year. It's usually not fatal, but it's very, very debilitating. I mean, if you have lupus, you have a disability. Your life is quite restricted. And the only treatment for it at the moment is this stuff called hydroxychloroquine, which probably none of us had heard of about a year and a half ago, but it became quite notorious last year for reasons that some people might remember. Someone who, unfortunately, for a while happened to be the president of the US, got it into his head that this was a great treatment for the coronavirus. I don't think there's any evidence to support this, but this is nasty stuff. I mean, people who have lupus today do take it, but it has very, very undesirable side effects, and it doesn't even do a particularly great job of treating lupus. So the team that I worked with were a group of postdocs who had been hired to work on a project to flesh out this idea that a senior researcher at the university had about a new compound that was potentially going to be a much, much better treatment for lupus, much more effective and with much lower side effects. So, I mean, that sounds like a pretty great story. This could be solving a big problem for 5 million people in the world. What these people realized is that the whole life sciences kind of medical field is really pretty complex. We automatically kind of zoom in on what the problem is for the patient, and that's what I've been talking about. They have this horrible disease and the treatment is really nasty. But in order to create impact in the life sciences, you've got to take account of the fact that there are a whole bunch of other players too. There are physicians that recommend medications to people. There are pharmaceuticals companies that at enormous cost bring these pharmaceuticals to the market. There's someone who pays for it, which is usually not the patient, but it's normally an insurance company. And the whole thing operates in a very tightly regulated environment. And I guess we'll understand this a lot better than we did 18 months ago because of the whole, coronavirus vaccine thing. But these postdocs realized that they needed to understand this system really well. They needed to make sure that they were solving the problem, not just for the patients, which it was pretty clear that they were, but they needed to understand the way that the physicians, the pharma companies, the providers, the regulators, the insurance companies, the way that all of these people saw the problem. And what they decided was that before they were willing to spend 3, 4, 5 years of their life working on this project, they wanted to make sure that this was actually really going to make a difference. And so they wanted to go out and talk to all of these people and make sure they understood the way they saw the whole lupus world, so that they understood exactly what they wanted to do. Now, it turned out that the head of their group didn't actually want them to be spending very much time on this. The head of the group felt that they, the head of the group, understood this whole situation pretty well, and that it was all under control, and that they just wanted the postdocs to do the work. So the postdocs felt passionately enough about this that they said to their boss, the head of the group, okay, we know that you understand this, but we feel like we owe it to ourselves that we feel like we need to understand this ourselves. We need to hear this ourselves firsthand from some of these people. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take, all three of us are going to take 2 weeks leave, and we're going to use our leave not to go and lie on the beach or be with our families. We're going to spend our leave going and talking to all these people so that we actually understand this problem. And then when we come back from leave, we'll all be ready to go. And that was what they did. And the circumstance under which I met them was that they were actually, during their leave, they were actually participating in a program that I was running that was a kind of a structured way of, okay, let's find all these people, let's go out and talk to them, let's figure out what questions we want to ask them, let's build up a picture of how they actually see this whole problem. And I just thought that was really impressive, that they felt committed enough to this, that they felt enough personal responsibility about this, that they were going to do it, in their own spare time. Now, hopefully most of us work in an environment where the conversations that we have with our management are a little different, and the management say, fantastic, I would love for you to go and figure that stuff out, and I would love for you to acquire the skills to do that, so that not only are you doing it for this project, but you've got those skills to do it for other projects too. That wasn't the way it turned out in this case. I think from what I've heard, their boss is now absolutely thrilled that they took that initiative themselves, and everything's kind of happy now. But I really was so impressed with this team, and so I, without kind of mentioning names and dragging people through the dirt, I kind of use this as a case study to remind myself that as a researcher, I'm the best person to drive the creation of impact for my research because I care about it more than anybody else. I said before that passion we need to direct it carefully and make sure that it doesn't blind us from hearing things that we don't want to hear about how beautiful our baby is. But instead we need to direct that passion to making sure that we know with a certain degree of confidence that the work that we're going to put into our research is really going to solve a real problem. And the only way to really figure that out is go out and talk to a bunch of people who are out there in the world of the problem that you're wanting to solve. And the fantastic thing that these guys in this particular story did is not only did they figure that out, did they take the time to figure that out for that particular project, but they put themselves in a situation where they were learning skills and tools and building confidence and building networks that would enable them to do it for the next project and the next one and the next one and the next one. So it kind of rewired their brains in terms of the way they think about research and the way they choose their research projects, the way they design their research projects, the way they spend their time as researchers. And, you know, I'm pretty sure it's going to mean that they avoid making the sorts of mistakes that I talked about in the first story. Anyone got comments or questions on that one? That's just
so I think, oh, sorry, Jonathan. I was just going to say, I think in summary, I think it's a really important lesson for, well, not just young academics, to postgrads and postdocs, to broaden out the opinions that you're getting on your work. Is that essentially what you're saying? Talk to as many people as possible.
Yeah, I guess it's about talking to the right people, and you kind of only know that they're the right people by kind of rummaging around. You know, we all back in the pre-COVID days, you know, we used to go to conferences and we'd all be in the same building together. Of course, there are the digital equivalents these days. I'm really talking about reaching outside the research community, reaching out to the people in the broader world who are the ones that care most about the problems that we're solving. And, you know, you will meet some of those people at conferences if you go to the right conferences, like back in the optical fiber world. Rod and I went many times, and Das and Christina to a conference called Optical Fiber Communications, which is a large conference and a very, very large trade show. So if you go to the trade show part of it, you will meet you know, all of the industry people or most of the industry people that you need to talk to in order to figure out whether your, you know, whether your research is really going to have impact. But it's very easy, even at a conference like that, to stay with the people that you know, to keep talking to the researchers, because Lord knows there's lots of interesting conversations to be had there. But this is all about being willing to kind of get outside your comfort zone and talk to people that maybe you wouldn't normally talk to otherwise, and be open to the idea that some of them might say, look, that might be interesting research, but we solved that problem years ago and we don't really care about it. You know, your solution might be 5% better than the existing ones, and that might be fantastic from a research point of view, but am I going to dump what I've got now to get something that's 5% better? No way. So, you know, industry people do have a different set of priorities from the ones that we have as researchers. And so if we really want our research to make a difference in the world, we've got to be familiar with those views. We've got to understand the way they think, and you know, we've got to be working with them. And I guess so that's kind of the love the problem, not the solution, as was pointed out before, is a slightly glib way of putting it. But I guess the key lesson there is, you know, our passion for our research is definitely our greatest strength. But let's just make sure that it doesn't blind us to seeing the truth, even if it is truths that we don't necessarily want to hear, because seeing and hearing that sooner rather than later is much less painful. And the Ophidium story was a story about not seeing it at the beginning and then having to deal with the consequences a few years later, which were much more painful. The timing thing, I guess, is an extension of the same thing, just understanding the context in which the problem exists and understanding the other things that need to happen in order for your type of solution to be useful. And then the third point is just that one of personal responsibility. Yeah, sure, there are technology transfer people at universities, and I'm lucky enough to have worked with both the RMIT and the Melbourne ones, and there are some fantastic people there. But, you know, there's one of those people for every 200 or 300 researchers or 400 researchers at the university. You can't expect them to do everything for you. They've got great contacts, they've got great advice, but we as researchers need to take the lead in making sure that our research is solving the real problem. No one else is going to do that for us. So if we're really serious about creating impact with our research, we've got to take some responsibility for that ourselves. Chris, before I just see if there are any final questions, if you don't mind, with Das's permission, I just wanted to insert a little commercial here. And another thing that I think is kind of follows logically from all the things that we've been saying is the idea that it's really important for those of us who are committed to creating impact with research, you know, either from the research side or the industry side. It's a tough game. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of persistence. And it's really helpful, in my experience, to be surrounded by other people who are moving in the same direction, even if they're working in very different fields, because the challenges that researchers face in creating impact are very common across research fields. So both RMIT and Melbourne do a really nice job of building communities within each of those universities to support researchers that are passionate about creating impact. What we at Cruxes want to do is kind of extend that, bring some of those communities together and create a national community of impact-focused researchers. So we're kicking off a series of 1-hour Zoom meetings starting next week, where we'll have a speaker who's someone that's got some success in this area and wants to talk about their you know, the lessons that they've learnt. So it'll be a different version and another perspective on some of the things that I've talked about. The speaker in this case will be someone that's got a lot more success than me at creating impact from research. So this is Professor Andre Luyten, whom some of you might know from IPAS at the University of Adelaide. He's also the co-founder of Quantex Labs that used to be called CryoClock. There are free tickets available for that event if you use that code there, and there's a URL on the screen to register for that. I will give Das and Chris these slides afterwards so that you'll have that information. But yeah, that talk is next week, and we'd love to see you there. That is all I have to say. Does anyone have any final questions or comments?
Jonathan, there is a question about the slides being mailed out. Is it possible for you to share the slides so I can? Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, so I'll PDF them and send them to you, Dustin, and maybe you can pass them around. And I just noticed there's a question from Kevin, if I can just take the last minute that we've got. In the spirit of the WILAB and taking steps to commercialising technology, what are my thoughts on Australia's key strengths when it comes to commercialisation? Yeah, look, I mean, the fact that our domestic market is quite small and that we're a fair way from the rest of the world is a challenge. But I mean, the great thing now is that we do have, you know, some tech companies like Atlassian and Canva, and you know, along with Cochlear and CSL and ResMed and others that are making quite a big splash on the world scene. So I think there are examples now to show that it is possible to make a big difference with Australian tech. And then, you know, of course, we've got examples like Wi-Fi and like some of the fantastic things that have come out of UOM and RMIT, you know, which have made a really big difference in the world. So we can do it. It's just, I think it's a matter of doing more of it, doing it more often, doing it more successfully. That's probably a somewhat elliptical answer to the question. But I mean, you know, it's really good news, for instance, that the Minister for Education over the last 9 months has been talking a lot about how we can further support the university system to drive more. He uses the word commercialisation, but if we use the broader term impact, to drive more impact from our research. So it'd be really great if we could see more support coming from the federal government for that. But yeah, I mean, the raw ingredients are definitely there. The quality of Australia's research is absolutely fantastic. So the raw ingredients are there. Yeah, let's just see if we can each take a little bit more responsibility for creating impact from our research and see if we can keep pushing.
Okay, well, on behalf of everyone, Jonathan, I'd like to thank you for a really entertaining talk, and we will make the recording available. I've seen the question come up in the chat a couple of times, so we'll take care of that. But thank you once again. Fantastic and inspirational talk.
Thanks for having me.